So last class we looked at the role of different cultures. We also contrasted, right, different cultural approaches. So we looked at some examples of different spectrums of culture. One of them being the difference between an individualistic or collectivistic culture, right? Individualistic is focused on our own achievement. Collectivist is much more focused on the needs and harmony among members of the group. And then we looked at some examples of application to this issue, including groups such as the Umatilla Reservation, and we're able to use that to better understand how members of different cultures might communicate. Communicating within a culture, right, is called intracultural communication. You are a member of that culture and you're communicating to a person that is within that same culture. Whereas intercultural communication is communicating with people that are in different cultures. One really easy way to think about this difference is interpersonal communication, which is the term you might need to know for the exam, right? Intrapersonal is communicating with yourself. Interpersonal is communicating with someone else. Intercultural, communicating within the same culture. Intercultural, communicating with a different culture. So we've had the chance to talk about the midterm, but I want to use today's class to talk about this issue of cultural intelligence and the importance of engaging in intercultural communication effectively. Additionally, we'll look at applying some of these skills of cultural intelligence into a scenario that I'll be asking you to look at for today's class. So this course will help us to better understand how we engage in communication among members of different cultures. So this issue of cultural intelligence is an important one. It's one that's kind of gained a lot of attention, especially over the last couple decades, and it's one that has become important for a lot of reasons. One of the big ideas here is this concept of globalization. So globalization is the idea that we have become significantly more globally connected as a set of human beings, right? As members of different countries, nationalities, and so on. We can see this in a lot of ways, both through our membership to international organizations, right? So the United Nations, the different kind of World Bank, IMF, or International Monetary Fund, the United Nations Security Council, and so on, are ways that we've had a global dialogue over the past several decades with members of other countries. We've seen, especially surrounding COVID-19, questions about our degree of global involvement with organizations including the WHO or the World Health Organization. So one cause of globalization, right, is our interconnectedness through these multinational or international organizations. Another factor is obviously the use of technology, right? So the way that we've chosen to be involved with others through things such as social media is a really big example, right? The #1 worldwide show on Netflix is Squid Game, which was produced in Korea, right? Its ability to attract a global audience and significant attention from people in the United States is an example of how globalization has been at play. Another way that globalization has occurred, right, is in the context of the concept of neoliberalism. Has anybody heard of or seen that term used before, neoliberalism? Cool. So neoliberalism is a concept in international relations that deals with a combination of two factors, right? We have greater globalization or global connectedness. We also have a focus on free trade. So many of the policies that we've pursued in the past several years have been focused on creating free trade between other countries. NAFTA, or the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, is one such example, right, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. There have also been global trade agreements through the European Union, many of its member states, and all sorts of parts throughout the world, right? For all of the kind of back and forth that the United States and China have had, we are deeply engaged in global trade with them, right? So the way that we engage in global trade under this idea that a free market is a way to solve or address many of these issues is deeply tied to this idea of neoliberalism, that a free market happening internationally is something that we see on a very regular basis. And if all of these things are true, we are a much more globally connected world, then we find ourselves actively engaging in a lot of kind of international agreements with other countries, and find ourselves more regularly engaging with people from different cultures. So this idea of cultural intelligence and understanding the needs of people within different cultures is an especially important one, right? So for instance, there's a lot of examples of US presidents who have said or done something that was considered to be inappropriate to another culture, right? Especially in areas like foreign diplomacy. For instance, shaking a hand of a German chancellor, right, might be considered to be not respectful or polite. The way that you might physically occupy a space through things such as gestures, proxemics, and so on, right, can be a major cause of significant issues between members of different international groups. Another key idea here is that a lot of employers, because we are so much more globally connected as a society, are much more concerned with our ability to communicate and engage with people within different cultures and diverse populations, right? Especially if you have a company or organization that is seeking talent from a lot of different walks of life, who's seeking a diverse workforce, right? Our ability to understand and engage in issues of cultural diversity is an especially important one. I want to show you a small clip that helps provide some additional context into this idea of cultural intelligence and its significance for us overall in the globe.
My father was a trader. He traveled the world, traveled every corner of the world, and I watched him do it. And he used to come home, and we used to talk about whether the world, as it got smaller, would fulfill its promise. And the promise was logical, that if the world got smaller, it would become more coherent. And he always swore that it wouldn't. It never would. The north and south and east and west, and men and women, and young and old, and people of all different faiths would remain as incoherent as ever. Part of his theory was that there were going to be too many people who followed him, and that the leaders of the world would become increasingly the flying dead. He used to talk about the flying dead a lot. People who fly around the world and who land for a day or a week or a month or a year or an hour in a place, and they're expected to deliver in it, and they have not got a clue what's going on around them. It was a pretty miserable version of the world, and I became increasingly interested in the idea that we all needed cultural intelligence, or CQ. Cultural intelligence to me is the ability to cross borders and boundaries between different cultures and actually thrive in so doing, love doing it and never want to not do it. I think the world won't change that much. When I started out, everybody kept on telling me that IQ was the secret to everything. You had to be jolly clever and pass every test that was ever thrown at you, and IQ was utterly crucial. And if I had a penny for all the idiots over the years who've said to me, if you could just take the people out of this problem, Julia, there would be no problem. And you think, what an idiot. I mean, just breathtaking. But fortunately, EQ came around, emotional intelligence. It wasn't too great for those of us who were women, because we were all supposed to be terribly good at it, but we'll miss that point out. But EQ began to take on, and people realized that there were things called human beings in this, and that on the whole it would be a good thing if leaders had a bit of EQ. Unfortunately, you then began to get people who say, I'm very good with people. And then they would forget those two extra words that need to go after it, which is like me. And I think increasingly you're now beginning to see people who know that you need CQ, the ability to work with people and lead people who are not like you.
So I think this example, right, is a good way to help to better understand and define cultural intelligence, right? So CQ, right, instead of IQ is being used here to describe this. But I like this discussion about the ability to communicate across and a desire to communicate across different cultures and different experiences, right? One idea that's been brought about in recent decades is this idea of standpoint theory, that who you are and how you understand the world is a result of the experiences that you've developed through socialization and life over time. One idea that I think is really interesting is she brings up that just because we can travel or fulfill this idea of the flying dead does not necessarily mean that we have developed the skills to communicate with people in different cultures, right? This is especially true because in a lot of different areas within international travel, there might be enclaves, co-cultures, or smaller groups that would primarily speak the language that we might be coming from. So while we do have the opportunity to engage internationally, we still might not be learning or engaging with the cultures in question. So this ability to understand and engage with people who are not necessarily like us is a crucial skill for us to develop and better understand over time. In order to understand cultural intelligence, there are 4 key factors. We're in the reading that I asked you to complete for today. Those are cognitive, motivational, metacognitive, and behavioral. And what I'm going to have us do is an activity where I'm going to ask you to essentially apply and use these different factors of cultural intelligence to a scenario which was kind of similar to what we heard in the video just now. So, in this scenario, Brendan has agreed to study abroad in Spain, but he's concerned about his ability to fit in and understand an entirely different population, right? He's moving to a totally new country, studying with a very different set of people, and studying a very different language than what he might be used to. So I'm going to split you into 4 larger groups, and each of those groups will be tasked with looking at one of the 4 factors of cultural intelligence. What I'd like you to do is have your group define its factor of cultural intelligence. In other words, based on your reading and notes, what is cognitive cultural intelligence? So I'll ask you to start by defining those. And then second, I'd like you to talk about how this factor of cultural intelligence can help Brendan to navigate his trip abroad. So given what you understand about this factor, what can that do to help Brendan on his journey? So I'll ask that each group has one person who is either writing or typing answers to these questions and has the names of all the group members on it. I will be asking you to turn that in at the end of class for your attendance credit for today. So let's have the group of 3 over here focus on cognitive. We'll have the rows over here focus on the motivational. We'll have the rows here focus on metacognitive, and then we'll have the rows over here on this side focus on behavioral. So within your groups, figure out answers to these questions. Make sure to have one person per group that is writing down and has the names of group members. Then I'll ask you to share. We'll talk about these 4 different factors together. Great. So let's chat about this together. I wanted to give you a scenario that will help us to apply and understand these different elements of cultural intelligence. So for each group, I'd like you to share both your definition, what is this form of cultural intelligence, and how can this form be used to help us understand Brendan's situation and adaptation. So let's start with the first group on cognitive.
So we said cognitive is just knowing about other cultures, so about their rules, norms, economic, legal systems, values, and beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And we said that can help him navigate his new lifestyle.
Yeah. So what might be some examples of his lifestyle that we could see the cognitive approach assisting?
Purchasing things, planning for things,
Mm-hmm.
what clothes he wears, what food he eats.
Yeah. So one way of thinking about the cognitive approach to cultural intelligence, right, is to think about it in terms of the knowledge that you have, right? So cognitive, you can think about as the wheels spinning inside your head, right? Cognitive intelligence is essentially like your library. So if Brendan is going to Spain and engaging with an entirely different set of people, then he's going to have to learn some of the rules, the customs, the behaviors, and so on. So as you all bring up, things such as the clothing he would choose to wear, not only to manage things such as the weather, but what's appropriate. A lot of times, right, there's norms that impact what clothing we should wear for the situation. Do you dress up formally for something like a big award or banquet presentation? Do you make sure that you're wearing clothes suitable to go in a store? This idea of no shirt, no shoes, no service. So that's an important element for Brendan to think about cognitively. What is the information he has about Spain, and how can he use that to engage appropriately with the needs of his own trip abroad? So that can definitely be one factor. You know, in addition to thinking about clothes, you might think about planning. How is he going to get to work? What type of transportation is he going to use? What type of language should he be prepared to speak? So cognitive emotional intelligence gets at, cultural intelligence gets at this importance of understanding the needs of a different population. Let's talk here with the second group on motivational.
Well, we pretty much summarized it as one's drive or want to open the, let me read with that. Drive and the wants of an individual to learn and adapt to something different than themselves and what they know. It allows, in this situation, would allow Brendan to be more open-minded with something that he might not be comfortable with.
Okay. I'm not sure why it's doing this echo here. Well, that's happening. Yeah, so the motivational approach is a really good way for us to think about, in many ways, a desire or willingness to engage in understanding and relating to members of a different culture, right? So I really like how your group brings up the example here of a sort of desire and willingness to understand the needs of other cultures, right? So motivational, if you think about your motivation to do something, like whether or not you're motivated to get out of bed, right? That's an element that plays into the choices that you might make. So if we think back to that video, one issue that's raised in that TED Talk is, again, the flying dead, or the idea that we don't care or don't have to learn about other cultures when we're traveling, because there are so many options available for us to speak a native language, or to find a set of people similar to us, even if we're in a totally different location. So the third group, metacognitive. How did you all address this question?
We put being aware of the other cultures and how you interact with them.
Mm-hmm. So how might Brendan use that in the trip abroad?
So that's just like the do's and don'ts of that area, being able to recognize.
Yeah. Sure. What might be a situation where he would need to, engage in that metacognitive, like a do's and don'ts type situation?
I don't know about like in Spain specifically, but I know in some places it's not polite to leave a tip somewhere.
Yeah, so a tip is a good example here, right? Depending on the culture, like in the United States, a lot of times you would want to leave a tip. It's a custom. Although there have actually been some restaurants and places in the U.S. where they'll say, we give everybody this wage, so you don't need to tip. But in general, right, that might be a big difference, is understanding something like that. So if you think about cognitive being the resources that we have, the knowledge we have that allows us to adjust, Metacognitive helps us to apply those skills, right? Meta typically means above something else. So more than just understanding, we're using the information that we have in order to make decisions and engage with other people respectfully. And then this final group here on behavioral.
We said it was just asking how you feel as a corporate when you're either in another culture or with people from another culture. So kind of like help him out. He needs to like try to understand the culture so he can act appropriately and not offend anybody with his behavior. So him trying to like read the room and kind of get like context clues of what other people's behaviors are so he can try to stay on so you can feel more normal and don't offend everybody.
Right. So the behavioral approach is very action focused, right? Behavior is what we do and how we express ourselves both verbally and non-verbally. So some of the choices that Brendan could make might include doing things such as listening a lot more, or seeing how willing other people are to talk over or interrupt each other, right? Or to what degree does eating factor into relationships with other people? Is it something where you talk and bond over food, or something where you're not supposed to talk at the table? So those are all things that Brendan can kind of use. But as you'll notice here, right, there's this kind of development over time between these different 4 factors. So when it comes to cognitive cultural intelligence, right, we start by understanding and thinking through the issue. We understand the ins and outs of it. We know how to navigate it and so on. We're motivated. We have a desire to learn and want to engage. Maybe it's a desire to learn about another culture, or maybe it's a need to survive and to fit in with the needs of entirely different populations. The film Lost in Translation, right, is one example where you have like a major couple who is existing in an entirely different world and trying to learn the ins and outs and how to survive. A metacognitive approach is not only understanding, but understanding how to use the information that you have. And then lastly, the behavioral approach is actually engaging in things that we consider to be sensitive to or supportive of the needs of a different population. So all of these 4 things together have a helpful set of ways for us to think about the roles of culture, our value of culture, and so on. So I'm going to have us wrap up a little bit early today since there's not a whole lot of new content. But we talked about cultural intelligence, right? Cultural intelligence helps us to understand the needs of different cultures. It also allows us to have a vocabulary, both in terms of our cognitive resources and our ability to use and apply those effectively. And lastly, cultural intelligence ties to intercultural communication because it allows us to understand how we choose to engage with other people. So going into Friday, I have a short piece that I'm asking you to read called Body Ritual of the Nasarima. It's an interesting piece that will relate to culture and identity. Again, I'll also be posting the midterm study guide and questions. And then I'm also going to be posting onto Canvas an anonymous feedback form. I like to do this kind of in the first few weeks of the class to get a sense of how things are going for you and any adjustments that I can make to better support you in the class. So stay tuned for a Canvas announcement later today that has that along with the practice exam questions and study guide. And as you're reading for Friday, take note. How is culture defined and talked about in the context of this Nasarima piece? So that does it for today's class, and I will see you again on Friday.